Good afternoon. Welcome to our Pennsylvania listeners, which includes pediatricians, nurses, nurse practitioners, practice managers, child health care consultants, and physician assistants. Today's topic is Let's Talk, recent Academy of Pediatrics policy statements on organic food and pesticides, implications for the practicing pediatrician. It's sponsored by the Pennsylvania chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics and the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine, and by Healthy Food Action, a project of the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, or IATP. I'm your moderator, Dr. David Wallinga, a physician with IATP. IATP works locally to globally to bring about a healthier, more sustainable food system. One, for instance, where the U.S. will no longer have 4 and 5 antibiotics being used in livestock production and to make animals grow faster. Our Healthy Food Action Project is a nationwide effort to engage health professionals in this effort. To find out more or to attend our free Healthy Food, Healthy Farms webinar series, visit healthyfoodaction.org. Today's information is educational in nature. It does not necessarily represent the views of IATP or views or policies of the Pennsylvania chapter of the AAP. The webinar is being recorded. If you haven't web access today, or if your colleagues would like to view the webinar later, the recording will be available via the Pennsylvania chapter's website next week. So please let any colleagues who aren't on the line today know about it. Slide handouts, and the evaluation form for getting continuing education credit for this webinar can be downloaded right now at the Pennsylvania chapter's website as well. Just remember, you need to complete this evaluation form in order to get CE credit within 2 weeks of the call. We hope this information has been helpful. And thanks again to the Institute as well as the Pennsylvania chapter who made the webinar possible. Please note that if you have any questions, write them down during the speakers' presentations or put them in the chat function or in the question function of the webinar tool. You'll see that on the right-hand side menu on your screen. And then we will collect them, and during the Q&A, we'll come back to the questions. The order of today's presentations is, first of all, Dr. Joel Foreman is going to be speaking for about 20 minutes, and then we're going to have 15 minutes of questions, followed by Dr. Jerry Paulson, and then another 15 minutes of questions at the end. But first, allow me to introduce Dr. Clara Felice, an American Academy of Pediatrics National Fellow, who in turn will introduce herself and then our speakers. Clara?
Hi, I'm Clara Felice. Thanks, David. I just wanted to briefly introduce myself today, and as both a resource and also as somebody with a perspective on this that's a little bit different from that of some other pediatricians that I've worked with in the past. So I actually worked in the Senate for a couple of years before going to medical school. And first as an intern for Senator Wellstone from Minnesota, and then for another senator, Senator Dorgan from North Dakota. And I would just like to take the opportunity to really share with you how important physicians' voices were in helping both these members as well as others that I interacted with in the House and the Senate in terms of crafting health policy. I think sometimes physicians wonder if their voices are valued at the national level, at the local level by their legislators and other decision makers. And I can tell you from both my experience working in the Senate and then now my experience working back in Washington for the National AAP office as a fellow, that the perspective that physicians have to offer, even if that's a short kind of perspective, either in writing or by phone or in a meeting, is incredibly valued. So I just really want to emphasize that. As far as a little bit of background, I went to medical school and residency in Chicago, and then following that time was at Yale for 2 years doing a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Clinical Scholars Program Fellowship in Health Services Research. And my work in environmental health there led me to my current position, where I'll be in the Washington office for 2 years working on environmental health and food and nutrition policy issues. So again, I really appreciate the opportunity to just kind of share my story with you, and I would welcome you to contact me if you have any questions about federal policy in these areas with the AAP. Thank you.
And now, Clara, if you could introduce our speakers.
So I'd like to introduce our first speaker for today is Dr. Joel Foreman. His major academic interest is in pediatric environmental health, and he's a member currently of the Academy's Council on Environmental Health, as well as a member of the CDC-led and pregnancy work group. He also co-authored the AAP's clinical report on organic foods, which was just published last November and released during our national conference. He's an associate professor of pediatrics and community and preventive medicine at Mount Sinai, and he also serves as the pediatric program director, residency program director, and vice chair for education at Mount Sinai, where he was also an intern resident and chief resident. So I will also, at this time, just introduce Dr. Jerry Paulson as well. So Dr. Paulson is a clinician, researcher, and advocate working to enhance child health, and particularly to identify and mitigate the impact of environmental hazards on pediatric populations. Dr. Paulson's a professor in the Department of Environmental and Occupational Health at the George Washington University School of Public Health and Health Services, and he's also a professor in the Department of Pediatrics at the George Washington University School of Medicine and Health Sciences. He's a co-director of the Mid-Atlantic Center for Children's Health and the Environment, which is a federally funded environmental health specialty unit affiliated with the Department of Environment and Occupational Health, which provides education and outreach to health professionals, parents, and the community. He has also served as a special assistant to the director of CDC's National Center on Environmental Health, focusing on children. And in addition to that, he received in 2000 a Soros Advocacy Fellowship for Physicians from the Open Society Institute. And he got his medical degree from Duke University and a bachelor's from the University of Maryland.
Go ahead and
So good morning, everyone. So I should say good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much, Clara, for that lovely introduction. It's really a pleasure to be able to present this information to you. So I'm Joel Foreman. I'm an associate professor here at Mount Sinai, and I worked when I was on the executive committee of the Council on Environmental Health with Janet Silverstein from the Committee on Nutrition with the Academy of Pediatrics to produce this clinical report on organic food, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So the focus is going to be on the implications for practicing pediatricians. And there we go. So I have no disclosures, financial or otherwise, so I'll just put that out front. So the learning objectives today are going to focus on two basic areas. One is to help all of you listening to be able to compare and contrast organic and conventional foods, particularly in terms of nutritional content, pesticide exposure, and drug-resistant bacteria from foods, particularly meats. And the second is to talk a little bit about the factors that contribute to the larger environmental impact of conventional as opposed to organic farming techniques, and particularly in terms of pollution, global climate change, and sustainability. So this came up as an area of focus for our two committees / councils because of the questions that pediatricians get. And there are many factors that motivate folks to choose organic over conventional. And this is just a little wordle that shows some of those things. It ranges from, in small print, because I think we will show have less impact nutritional value, sometimes about avoiding exposures like pesticides, sometimes about global issues like carbon footprint and climate change, many different things. And so we felt motivated to examine as best we could these issues and try to come up with a distillation of the main issues and some tools for pediatricians to give advice. So the first one I'll sort of dismiss with quickly is nutrient content and nutrition. And just to show you an example of the kinds of studies that are out there, there are many, many studies that look at varying nutrient content of organic versus conventionally farmed, particularly fruits and vegetables. This is from Washington State University, and it was actually a sort of meta-analysis approach to multiple different studies looking at paired analyses of different fruits and vegetables between organic versus conventional farming. And the results are variable. They looked at things like phenolics and quercetin. These are antioxidants and felt to have a health benefit, as in reducing, say, cardiovascular risk, and then other nutrients like, say, vitamin C and E. And studies like this do purport to show, on balance, increased benefit from organic, but other studies show the opposite. And part of the problem with these studies is there are many factors that are very difficult to account for. And we looked closely at this, and our final conclusion was that the current evidence isn't convincing one way or the other, and that this isn't a big factor that one can use to make this choice. But on the other hand, there's lots of unanswered questions that still need to be looked at. And the kind of factors that impact on the nutrient content of different fruits and vegetables include things like soil conditions, meaning moisture, heat, climate conditions at the time, when the food was harvested, how long from harvesting to testing for nutrient content, maturity of the vegetables, how it was stored and processed before testing, and all of these things can lead to small differences in nutrient content that could wash out differences from the organic versus conventional approach. The second issue is that although you could show a difference, and these are somewhat small, we don't really have evidence that these differences are clinically relevant, and that's, of course, an unanswered question. Does it really matter that you have 10% more vitamin C in your diet than not? And so with those questions both difficult to answer and relatively unanswered in the current literature, we felt that the differences in nutrient quality was not proven yet to be substantial between organic and conventional. And I'm just going to keep moving. There's more to it, but we have limited time. But that was the first issue. The second main motivating factor is often an attempt to reduce exposures to things that might be harmful. And amongst those things are pesticides, bacteria that might be resistant to drugs, exposure to hormones like estrogens, and bovine growth hormone, particularly around milk. So I'll deal with these one by one. There's lots of data about high-dose exposure to pesticides and all kinds of adverse health effects, ranging from acute toxicity to cancer. But I'm going to focus on lower dose exposures, and there's a fair amount of prospective cohort data that looks at exposures to, say, organophosphate pesticides, one particular class, and pretty significant, I think, meaningful health outcomes. And they range from things like decreased scores on the Bailey Developmental Test, both for mental and psychomotor indexes at 36 months of age or 3 years, behavioral issues, again, using a pretty good validated test like the Childhood Behavior Checklist, some newborn reflexes, decrease in anthropomorphic measures like birth weight, head circumference, and length. And then probably one of the most interesting ones is the Ashkenazi study at the bottom that looked at Bailey's at 24 months old of children born to farm worker mothers in California who had some pesticide exposure, probably related to proximity to or their occupation in the farms. So there's some evidence that pesticide exposure, and these are lower dose, and I'll get to that in a minute, could be associated with important adverse outcomes in young children. There's also studies that are, we think, particularly relevant that look at whether or not you can change your exposure by changing your diet. And although small, most evaluators feel these are well-designed studies. And this is an example of one by Liu et al. From 2006 that took a small group of kids, 23, and basically fed them conventional fruits and vegetables, switched them to organic, and switched them back, and measured their urine for residues of pesticides. And I think you can all see my pointer. And basically what you can see, and these are two different types of residues from two different organophosphate pesticides, they start higher, and when you go on an organic diet, it can be bumped down, and when you go back, it goes back up. And these are pretty significant and convincing findings that you can at least alter your exposure. It still leaves the question of whether or not that these changes are clinically relevant, and we'll come to that. But it does show that you can make a choice that will change your exposure, and then you have to decide whether you think that change in exposure is meaningful. And one way of looking at that is to say, well, what is the level of exposure here? And is it in the level that might be associated? So what's interesting to look at, we thought, was if you look at the Ashkenazi study, the median level of pesticides in those women when they were pregnant is in the same range as the levels that were seen in the children in the study you just saw when they were on conventional diets. So they seem to be in the same range. We're not off by many magnitudes. On the other hand, this study by Eskenazi looked at prenatal exposure, and this looked at childhood exposure, and those are a bit of different things, and we know that the different windows of exposure can be quite different, but it still leaves, it implies to us that there is potentially a significant exposure that would be worth avoiding. The next issue is drug-resistant bacteria. And for this, there actually is quite a bit of evidence that the non-therapeutic use of antimicrobials in farm animals does lead to an increased chance that there would be drug-resistant bacteria in those meats. And in fact, there was some discussion after our publication came out, and this one, number 4, came out in Annals this past year, sort of purporting that there was no difference at all between the foods. They actually also found the same thing that we did, which is that there really is a different risk of being exposed to drug-resistant bacteria in meat that was farmed with the non-therapeutic use of antibiotics. So it's important to note that a fairly large amount of antimicrobials used in the United States are used on farm animals and not on people. And about 3/4 of this is not used to treat an illness, but it's used to either, quote, prevent illness in the very tightly packed farm animals, or to simply increase the yields, bigger animals, more meat. And many of these, in fact most of the antimicrobials used are very similar, if not the same ones we treat people with. And it's long been shown to change the colonization in humans if you're on, and animals if you use non-therapeutic antibiotics. There's lots of disease outbreaks that have been traced in good epidemiologic studies right back to contaminated meat with bacteria that are resistant to the antibiotics that were used in those animals. And in fact, this nice analysis done by Smith and Spangler did a nice review of meats bought in the market and found that there was about 1/3 less chance of having drug-resistant bacteria if you bought organic. And the reason is that organic husbandry prohibits the non-therapeutic use of antibiotics. 2 other things to consider. This first one, estrogens. There's some concern about estrogen exposure through meat when the cows have been treated with estrogens, and this is a common practice where the estrogen pellets are implanted usually behind the ear to make the animals bigger. Most studies have shown that estrogen levels in meat are not so different. They remove obviously the piece of the cow that had the estrogen pellets in it, and estrogen concentrations in organic and conventional milk were also quite similar and very low compared to human milk. There's one study which is somewhat flawed that looked at red meat consumption. It was a retrospective study where you asked adults what they were eating in high school that showed potentially a connection between estrogen-sensitive breast cancer and meat consumption many years before. But it is a flawed study, but and we wouldn't draw conclusions from it, but it does raise some interesting questions. And then bovine growth hormone is worth touching on. A lot of people want to buy milk that is from bovine growth hormone untreated cows, and it's a major reason consumers cite for preferring organic milk because of this. And it's used to increase yield, and it's very true that the use of BGH in cows increases your yield by up to 10 to 15%. But growth hormone is very species specific, and the structure of bovine growth hormone is thus quite different from human. And even that gets through, most of it is destroyed by pasteurization. There's really not any evidence that bovine growth hormone makes it through to milk in a way that has any clinical impact on people. So then on to the third area, which is what about the sort of larger environmental impact of organic farming in terms of global climate change, diversity, and costs. So traditional agriculture accounts for about 20% of all of the greenhouse gases produced from the IPCC analysis. This, when I first read it, sort of struck me as quite large. In addition, pesticide and herbicide runoff from their widespread use in conventional agriculture may have other effects on the environment. There's been contention that it may reduce honeybees and diversity in honeybees, reduction in diversity of vegetables, and then of course eutrophication, which is when nitrogen products get into water, promote the growth of green algae and other plants that cover the surface and lead to hypoxia and kills off the animals and plants that live in the lakes. The kinds of pesticides and herbicides that are used frequently get into surrounding water supply, and much of the United States gets its water from, quote, groundwater, so wells, community, or private. And 90% of the corn industry relies heavily on, say, atrazine as a common herbicide, and it turns out to be one of the most commonly found contaminants in streams and groundwater. So it's pretty clear that there is more pollution with pesticides and herbicides in conventional than organic farming. Now, one of the issues which I'll come back to in a couple slides is that organic costs more, and that's quite true, but the question is, does it need to? And the best studies to look at the productivity of organic farming and the costs involved have come out of the Rodale Institute, which is a Cornell University project in Pennsylvania, and they have literally a couple of decades of excellent prospective comparisons of different plots of vegetables grown in 3 different ways: conventional, one that used animal manure, and vegetable-based organic, and one was exclusively organic. And essentially what they have found over this really long period of time is that the yields actually are comparable. In fact, in some years organic does better, in some years it does worse. They're quite close. And so if you know how to do it, in other words, follow modern organic farming techniques, you can come up with quite comparable yields. On the other hand, they did confirm that it was more expensive. Mostly it's human labor, because you need more human labor to control presumably weeds and other things like that. But they also made more money, interestingly, off the organic because they can charge more for it. They also were able to confirm they used less fossil fuels, about 30%, which goes to the global climate change and greenhouse gases. And they found that organic soil matter was better conserved, probably because it had more organic matter in it, and particularly during the drought year, during the study of 1999, that did particularly better. Some of the organic fertilizer, which had nitrates in it, did show some leaching into surrounding testing of water. And herbicide leaching from the conventional farming really did get high and exceeded the EPA maximum contaminant level, again, for atrazine, just as expected. So the sort of conclusion from this is that, yes, it is more expensive in some ways, but that if you know what you're doing and there's good science, that organic yields can be quite comparable to conventional farming. However, those cost analysis ignore some very important factors, and those are unmeasured costs in conventional foods. We know, for instance, that there are a lot of farm worker costs involved that don't make it to the price you pay at the store. And these include diseases related to pesticide exposure in farm workers. There's neurodevelopment effects in those offspring of farm workers, which we end up paying for, medical costs, educational costs that don't make it back in. And then what about the people who get sick from resistant bacteria? Again, those costs are borne by other parts of our society and don't actually make it back into the cost at the market, but they're in there somewhere. Then there's also the issue of cleanup, and we have certainly seen here where there have been sites where former farm areas are no longer usable when they want to be converted over to some other use, say a school or a residential area, and need to be cleaned up. And those costs are borne by others too. And then there's the sort of larger issue of biodiversity, which one could argue about, but it seems that there is some evidence that biodiversity has decreased. So what about that price premium? It's certainly real. This is just from USDA from 2009, and as you can see, it's variable depending on what sort of fruit, but this is the premium for organic, from anywhere as low as maybe 5% to as high as, say, 60%, and then for vegetables up to 75% difference, and it's quite variable between one and another. So right now, when people go shopping, there is a difference. The same can be seen for milk, and it's pretty substantial. Anybody who goes to the market knows that organic milk is substantially more expensive. But as time goes on and more large supermarkets get involved in selling organics, the supply and demand factors tend to push the prices down. So there is some hope as it becomes more and more mainstream and drives more and more large-scale organic farming that these cost differences might recede. But the cost differences are important because we don't want people to reduce their consumption of fruit and vegetables, for instance, in a quest to get organic at the expense of an adequate amount in their diet. So given all of that data, we have sort of drawn some important conclusions, which I'll review quickly and then open up for questions. The first was, as I mentioned, we really don't think there's direct evidence of a clinically relevant nutritional difference between organic and conventional produce. The second point is that there clearly are less pesticides, not none, but less in organic than conventional produce. And that if you eat organic fruits and vegetables, you reduce your exposure. What's important to ask after that is how important is this clinically, and there is some evidence that the level of exposure of pesticides in conventional produce might be at a level that has been associated with adverse neurocognitive outcomes in the first few years of life, particularly if it's fetal exposure and maybe young kids. A lot of more research needs to be done, but there is at least some that shows that this could be important. The next point is that there really is the potential to reduce human disease caused by drug-resistant organisms by banning the non-therapeutic use of antibiotics in raising farm animals like poultry and pork. And USDA Organic now ensures this. You can also buy antibiotic-free, but this is clearly an important thing. The final point here is about milk, and we really don't think there's a clinically relevant difference between organic and conventional milk, either in terms of nutrition or bacterial contamination or the BGH issue. And then finally, important to put a reminder out that the AAP clearly feels and has great evidence that unpasteurized or raw milk carries some substantial risks for infection with organisms like, say, listeria, et cetera, and that we don't recommend consumption of raw milk at all, whether conventional or organic. In terms of costs, organic is more expensive at the moment, but it could be better, and there's good science that shows that you can do farming at comparable costs. And there are some factors in the market that may reduce this price differential as time goes on. In the larger environmental impact, clearly organic has a reduced impact in terms of fossil fuels and pollution, and may also be beneficial for global climate change. So what do you tell families? We hope that everybody emphasizes first that a healthy diet rich in fruits, vegetables, and whole grains and low-fat or fat-free milk and dairy products is important. But we think we can be explicit. We can talk about what the evidence is. We can talk about the potential health benefits, primarily pesticide exposure and drug-resistant bacteria. And we should re-emphasize to everyone that pasteurization is very important to prevent bacterial infections. You can talk about costs, and again, we don't want costs to keep people from eating healthy foods. And that's quite important, but we can also give tools to help families be selective because exposure does vary. And we should acknowledge that the motivation to reduce larger environmental impact is legit. So these are just some resources, and I'll stop here. And they include resources for families as well as for healthcare professionals like Healthy Food and Healthcare from Healthcare Without Harm for people who are trying to organize to make these changes. And some of the resources in our article go through some important definitions of organic and what it means to be 100% regular organic or made with, which means 70%, and for some of these other terms and what they mean. It's important to know things like cage-free have very little meaning. There is a definition, but it's very vague, and cage-free eggs has basically no meaning. In terms of picking and choosing if cost is a matter, we like environmental working groups, Dirty Dozen, Clean 15, and you can then look and see if you have limited dollars to spend, perhaps you'll focus on buying organic in the Dirty Dozen, but maybe I'll just get regular corn in the Clean 15 because there's not so much evidence that there's high pesticides in corn. So with that, I'll stop and be happy to take questions and leave up some references for people who would like to look at them.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Foreman. And let me just reiterate that on the Pennsylvania chapter's website are links to the full report from the AAP if you want to download that as well. So let's start off with a question from Deborah Burrows. Can you comment, Dr. Foreman, on the feedback you've received from the AAP members regarding the clinical report? Or what have been the most common concerns or questions?
So for the most part, I think we've received pretty positive feedback. I think people have commented that our references, including the table within our own article that gives definitions, and the Environmental Working Group site are useful. A lot of the questions revolve around cost and, how do I make these choices? So I think those materials are have proven quite helpful. The other thing has been the article that came out of Stanford, fairly close to ours, raised some controversy, and people were concerned that this other article that I cited in this presentation seemed to say that there was no difference at all. But it turns out actually that's just what got carried in the press. And what they said was different. They really had three conclusions which are interesting. One is they concluded, just as we did, that the risk of exposure to drug-resistant bacteria is higher in conventionally farmed animals. And that's right up front in their conclusions. So that really wasn't different. They concluded there was no nutrient difference, and we sort of concluded the same thing, so we didn't differ. And then on the pesticide issue, interestingly, they did conclude that there were higher pesticide residues in conventional fruit and vegetables. But they discounted that by saying, well, but the levels in fruits and vegetables rarely exceed government standards. And we differ because we don't believe those government standards are necessarily designed or can take into account the health risks, particularly to vulnerable populations like young kids and fetus. And we think there is evidence that that the levels of exposure could be concerning, and thus think it is legitimate to try to avoid exposure by choosing organic fruits and vegetables. So on 2 of the 3 points we actually agreed, and only on the last one was there a difference, and it's a matter of how one interprets the data and what you think are important standards or not. And I think, you know, government standards are constantly moving and are not necessarily a reflection of health-based outcomes. So we've seen that repeatedly. Lead is a great example. At one point, you know, government standards for lead exposure were much, much higher than they are now. It's not that lead became less toxic. It's just that we learned more and the standards moved.
Now, I think the media report, too, is often from the perspective of the consumer, but Dr. Eskenazi's study, which you cited, you know, focused on the issue of exposures to farm workers and their families and farmers' families. So I guess one could say there's a difference in the exposure to those who are some of our patients as well.
Absolutely.
Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. There clearly is a different, you know, the effect on farm workers is fairly significant. There are overt poisonings, plenty of them, that can be found in the poison control database related to agriculture. And then these are more subtle exposures, but clearly farm workers and their families are exposed, and their offspring are too. And Dr. Eskenazi's study, I thought, was really pretty substantial and important in that it showed, you know, a significant difference in these neurocognitive outcomes as measured by a standardized test that's very well validated at the Bailey, and at levels of exposure that are really not that different from what we see with conventional fruits and vegetables.
Yeah. Now, you'd mentioned in the report there's a table on food labels, I think, and how to interpret those. And there's a question from Barbara Cohen about how can we trust the labeling? For instance, if you go to the grocery store, a lot of the chicken will say be labeled as, you know, no hormones or no antibiotics. What should we make about those labels, and how adequate are they?
So there are some laws about this. So one of the nice things about USDA Organic, with all of the potential, you know, all of the issues that some people raise with the program, is that it does have fairly strict definitions. So an organic chicken we can be, I think, fairly confident, was not given antibiotics. And I think that's helpful, and the same for pork and things like that. So if it's USDA organic labeled, that's useful. The federal government also, I believe, regulates the no antibiotics for meats, and that also, if they can show the Food and Drug, I think it's FDA, no, maybe it's USDA, excuse me, that they didn't use antibiotics, that also is fairly reliable. I think that issues of the use of antibiotics are reliable for meats. The hormones, I think it varies, and when you talk about markets, like farmers markets, it's really knowing your producer, and that is more difficult. It puts a lot of onus on the consumer to know the farmer that's providing the produce and the meats and chicken. I'm a big supporter of labeling because I think it at least gives accurate information. I think standard programs like the USDA Organics Program, National Organics Program, provides that. They do require inspections, actually, and there's some costs involved. And they provide, of course, the guidelines on how to do and how to undertake the farming. So I think that it's challenging, and that's why we tried to put in the table and put in the definitions that we knew. There's many other things that are not as reliable, many of the labels that are not as reliable.
Yeah, I've actually worked myself quite a bit on the antibiotics issue, so I wanted to just jump in with two comments. That the hormone in poultry and pork is kind of deceptive when you see it labeled as no hormones, because actually they're not allowed by law.
Correct. That's right.
And on the antibiotics, kind of the bugaboo is the enforcement. So in practicality, the USDA spends very little trying to enforce label claims. So there is some concern that people might be labeling incorrectly, but then not being caught at it. So I think that's always a question. I think that's maybe less true for the organic label. But I've also unmuted Doctors Felice and Paulson, so jump in if you have questions of your own.
Certainly agree. Just wanted to add, you're absolutely right that you cannot use hormones in poultry and pork. So those are, you can say there's none, but there's none in any. But I would also argue that the studies that look at sort of market samples of, say, chicken for the presence of drug-resistant bacteria are fairly convincing to me. And though what you say is true, can you believe it? If you go to the market, obviously, you buy them, then you do see a difference in exposure or potential exposure to drug-resistant bacteria.
That's right. Going back to our question room, one person commented that the speakers had an echo. I think that might be because I opened up the mics on some of the other presenters. So I can, if the echo is really bothersome, I can close those again. And maybe I'll mute myself in between questions. We've heard something over the last year about arsenic, particularly in rice, but I think also in apple juice. What can we share with families about natural arsenic in those things? Or did you look at that in the report?
So this is Joel. We didn't look at arsenic in the report, but since the report has come out, obviously this has been an issue and it's been in the press. And I know that Jerry was involved in a pretty nice statement from the Academy of Pediatrics addressing this. I think there's still things that are not known and potentially some concern, but people probably need to know the different kinds of arsenic that are out there. So we're talking inorganic versus organic, and it's sort of just the reverse of mercury. Organic arsenic is felt to probably be less, if not non-toxic, and that's what you would get from consumption of, say, seafood. And inorganic arsenic, which is naturally occurring in the ground but also present in some herbicides and pesticides, is the one that is of more concern. The variability in rice, as I understand it, is very wide, and there's many factors that contribute. It could be naturally occurring arsenic in the water and the soil. It could be from former use of pesticides or current use of pesticides and herbicides, and makes it quite complicated. Right now, you can't sort of get a reliable label on the products to know what the arsenic content is, but I'm aware, I believe, of some of the farmers for rice are working to test their rice, so there will be some sort of way for consumers to know. One of the things the Academy put out, and Jerry can step in, which I thought was really smart, is that we generally introduce baby rice cereal as the first food past breast milk, say, and that's sort of arbitrary. It was probably based on beliefs about allergy that are not substantiated, and there's no reason to not to start with another baby cereal, like, say, oats. And so that's certainly a reasonable choice for people to make if they so choose. I don't know if Jerry wanted to add anything about arsenic.
Joel, this is Clara Felice, and I have a comment, and Jerry, please step in as well. The FDA, in response to both their own research on arsenic and also in response to both the Dr. Oz show and Consumer Reports findings over the last year or so, has embarked upon a pretty comprehensive evaluation of arsenic in rice projects, as you mentioned. And they're considering setting new standards for arsenic in both food products as well as in juice. And that would be in addition to the EPA standards for arsenic in drinking water. And we anticipate that they'll come out with more information about their study, as well as recommendations in the next couple of months, is what we've heard.
This is Jerry. I think that both Joel and Clara summarized the arsenic situation right now, and I think we do need to await the further findings from the Food and Drug Administration.
This is Joel. Just to second that, that's one of the reasons why I thought the advice that the Academy came up with, to just point out that if people wanted to be precautionary, awaiting that advice and additional data, they could choose to start with, say, a different baby rice cereal with no real downsides to that. And I thought that's, some people would like to choose that precautionary approach, and that is great. And then the basic general advice is that a well-balanced, healthy diet is probably the best thing we can all do for ourselves and our kids, and we should make sure to stay focused on that and not get distracted too much by these concerns until they're well worked out.
I guess the last thing I would say is for parents who are really anxious, you know, juice is not one of the essential foods, and there's no child who has to, you know, drink juice that may have some small amounts of arsenic in it. They can be quite healthy on an otherwise balanced diet. This is Jerry. David, we're not hearing you.
Yeah, it's Joel. I'm not hearing anybody either. Are we moving on to the second part of the talk?
Yeah, so this is Jerry Paulson. I'm currently the chair of the executive committee of the Council on Environmental Health for the American Academy of Pediatrics. And 1 month we published the organic information, and then a month or so later we published a nice document on the use of pesticides. The lead authors were Catherine Carr from the University of Washington and James Roberts from the Medical University of South Carolina. So I'm going to present some of the information from that particular document. The work of the Mid-Atlantic Center is partly funded by ATSDR and EPA, and they do not assume any responsibility for whatever I have to say. So the publication in Pediatrics did include information on acute intoxication with pesticides. And we know that many children who have acute intoxications are not properly diagnosed. And so I invite you to review that material, but on the other hand, I think for the practicing pediatrician, for the office-based nurse practitioner or physician's assistant, issues of long-term low-dose exposure to pesticides are really very important. And while we may have learned something about acute intoxication in medical school or house staff training or nursing school PA&P training, none of us learn much at all about chronic low-dose exposure. So that's why I want to focus on that. Excuse me. And I also want to point out that when people say pesticides, oftentimes it seems as if they're talking about insecticides, but the definition of pesticides is much larger. Kids are exposed to pesticides everywhere they go, whether it's home, inside the house, outside the house, whether it's cleaning agents at home. Same thing in school. Sometimes the schools are sprayed, or the schoolyards are sprayed, or the kids are exposed into cleaning agents that are technically pesticides in the school. And of course, there are pesticide residues, as Joel mentioned, particularly in terms of food that is not produced via organic methods, but there are a few pesticide residues even in organic foods. A lot of people report the use of pesticides in their own homes, and there's a minority of people who use a lot of pesticides in their homes. And I think one of the things that's sort of a takeaway here for anticipatory guidance is that people should not be using pesticides in homes, either that they apply or that they have professionally applied, except as a last resort. And I'll circle back to that issue as I come to the end of my presentation. And I also want to point out that when parents are asked, they say that they get a lot of information about pesticides from pediatricians. And so parents seem to think that we are authority figures here, and we probably should use that as a means of influencing parental behavior. There's some data now, a little bit old, but NHANES, as you all are well aware, produces information based on representative samples of the U.S. population. And in some data that was collected at the beginning of the 2000s, about 20% of kids had been exposed to pesticides either in their home or their yard. And in most of those cases, 3/4 of those cases, the pesticides were applied by a non-professional. In those homes that had high levels of exposure, that is, that were treated that were treated at least 2 times a month, interestingly enough, a lot of those were non-professional, but a lot of them have professionals coming in more than once a month. And I, for one, find that very concerning. Joel, in his report on the organics, mentioned some of these outcome studies, and I'm going to mention some of the ones that he did and some other ones in a little bit more detail, because again, I think for the frontline clinician seeing parents in an office setting, this information is important for understanding why, if you get questions, you want to counsel parents to really limit exposure to pesticides at home to the extent that they can in school or in parks and playgrounds, and to incorporate some of this into your anticipatory guidance. So there's a study that's been collecting data at Mount Sinai Medical Center in New York, where Joel's based, a number of maternal infant pairs looking at organophosphate metabolites in maternal urine as a marker for exposure during pregnancy. And one of the things that they also looked at was whether the moms had high or low levels of peroxidase 1 activity. This is an enzyme that is genetically, the level of the enzyme is genetically determined, and people can be divided into high and low levels of production of PON1 or peroxidase 1. And they looked at these kids with obviously well codified developmental and IQ testing at 12 and 24 months, and then very importantly at 6 and 9 years of age with the Wechsler scale. And basically what they found is decreased mental development with higher organophosphate metabolite levels in the mom. And this is going to sound like a repeat of the lead story. Again, this is low-level exposure to pesticides and its small decrements in IQ, not enough for the individual child necessarily to be identifiable in a gross kind of way. But when you look at large groups of these children, you find these differences, and at a population level, these differences become very important. And the difference in maternal metabolism of the organophosphate by this peroxidase 1 enzyme also influenced the outcome. Another study going on in New York City with another prospective study enrolling moms, following kids after birth. This is the way we really need to do environmental health research in general and pesticide research in particular. They were looking at a pesticide called chlorpyrifos, and this study by Rao et al. Followed the kids up to, right now, 7 years of age is their most recent report. They're continuing to follow these kids even further. And again, small decreases in IQ and memory associated with increased exposures to chlorpyrifos, a well-controlled study looking at maternal IQ and maternal education and other confounding factors. And again, I just want you to bring to mind all that we've learned with lead over the years and all we've learned about vulnerable periods of exposure that as the brain develops in utero and continues to develop obviously throughout the lifespan, because full myelinization, for example, is not finished until about age 25, but the early years of central nervous system development obviously being extremely important, so that any factor, be it lead, be it pesticide, or other toxicant that interferes with brain development, as we do more studies, seems to lead to these low-level changes that for populations are not good. Joel mentioned the CHAMACOS study, Brenda Eskenazi and her group's work in the Salinas Valley in California. Again, these are farm workers, so they may be exposed through what's going on at their parents' workplace or through drift of pesticide into farm worker housing that's close by the fields. And again, a long-term follow-up using urinary metabolites of organophosphates in the mom during her pregnancy and kids up to 5 years of age with a Wessler Intelligence Scale for children as the outcome measure at age 7. And looking at the urinary metabolites, the kids with higher urinary metabolite levels had more problems with memory, with processing speed, with verbal comprehension, and a decrement of 7 points of IQ for those kids whose moms had the highest maternal highest concentration of the metabolite in their urine. Interestingly enough, in this study, the vulnerable period seems to be in utero exposure because there was no correlation with cognitive scores and the children's metabolite panels after birth. Now, many of you have seen this particular graph. A lot of us who talk about lead poisoning use this graph, but it's really applicable in this discussion of pesticides as well. So if you look at the normal distribution curve on the left-hand side of this image, you can see, as you know, by definition, the mean IQ is set to be 100. And if IQ is distributed on a normal distribution curve, that means in the population of children in the United States, there are about 6 million intellectually gifted kids and 6 million intellectually impaired kids, i.e. IQs greater than 130 or less than 70, respectively. If you shift the mean IQ of the population only by 5 points, and this is the right-hand image, or the right-hand graph on this image, then for any individual child, that change may or may not be noticeable. But at a population level, you have markedly decreased the number of children in the population who are intellectually gifted and markedly increased the number of kids in the population who are intellectually impaired by actually 57%. And so again, that's why this is such an important issue on a population basis. We need to work with our local schools, our local government agencies, to have them limit the exposure of kids to pesticides in schools, in parks, and in playgrounds. We need to counsel our parents to limit their kids' exposure. Even in our own homes or in our own offices, we should not be using pesticides. There are other adverse outcomes that have been associated with pesticides. A meta-analysis of 19 studies looking at orophacial clefts and an odds ratio of 1.37, almost 1.4, for kids with oral clefts in mothers exposed occupationally to pesticides, and a smaller odds ratio of 1.16 for paternal exposure. Now, one of the problems with a lot of these studies is that in contradistinction to what I described at Mount Sinai and at Columbia and in the Berkeley study that's being done in the Salinas Valley, all those studies we know what pesticides the researchers are looking at. In many of the other studies, because the data is gathered by parent self-report, it's just was exposed to pesticide or not exposed to pesticide. And obviously pesticides vary tremendously in their chemical composition, and so that's why this data, while it raises red flags, is certainly not definitive data. There have been numerous studies over the years looking at pesticides and cancer, and again, cancer is not any one single disease. The epidemiologic studies that are better done tend to focus either on leukemia or on brain tumors. Again, leukemia is not a single disease and brain tumors are not a single disease, but there are consistent studies that show associations between paternal occupation or family use of pesticides and either leukemia of one sort or another or brain tumors of one sort or another. And these review articles are listed below. The evidence for acute lymphocytic leukemia in the review by Zom and Ward in 1998, and then the Infante Rivard review in 2007. Both of these large-scale reviews had multiple studies that showed an association between pesticide exposure, usually in the mom pre-conception or during pregnancy, with the development of acute lymphocytic leukemia in the offspring in early childhood. Again, none of these studies have good biomarkers of exposure. A lot of them are based on self-report, and we all know that when families are confronted with a kid with any serious disease, they are much more likely to pick out something in their history that worries them, that they believe might be associated with the ultimate development of a disease, than if they did not have a child with that disease. And then in several other meta-analyses published in Environmental Health Perspectives in 2009 and 2010, again, an association with fairly high odds ratios between parental occupational exposures, and importantly in these studies, some of them at least separated out insecticides from herbicides, whereas others did continue to lump all pesticides together, and home and garden pesticides as opposed to things that may be used for rodents or other pests. The Infante-Rivard review looked at brain tumors, astrocytomas, and household insecticide use with an odds ratio of 2.5 in that particular study, and astrocytomas and maternal insecticide use with an odds ratio of 1.9 in that study. And then paternal occupational exposure before conception, so hypothetically this exposure is doing something to the male sperm that then when conception occurs ultimately results in the development of brain tumor in that offspring. And then a lot of other studies giving suggestive information but not being statistically significant. So what choice do families have? What choice does a school district have? What choice does a park district have in terms of minimizing pesticide use and thereby pesticide exposure either to adult men and women who may become parents or to pregnant women or to the young children. And this is a process known as integrated pest management. And while integrated pest management is not an absolute ban on the use of pesticides, the concept is to use least toxic methods of pest protection first and leave pesticides only for a last resort, and to use very non-toxic pesticides or apply pesticides in a way that minimizes human exposure. For example, homes that have pests, rats, cockroaches, mice, often have some kind of pathway, a crack in a wall, an opening around a pipe that leads to the outside that provides a mechanism of entrance for the pests, and merely blocking that pathway with something like steel wool, because when the rats and mice chew on the steel wool to try and get back into the house, it tears up their mouths and they go away. Or putting in caulking or things like that can do a lot to limit the ingress of the pests. Unfortunately, a lot of our patients were never well schooled by their own families on issues like washing the dishes shortly after they're used, and people may leave dishes stacked up in the sink for a day or so. And basically pests need the same thing that we need. They need a little bit of food and a little bit of moisture, and it can't be too hot or too cold. And those are the environments that they thrive in, so that if they've got unwashed dishes in a sink and there's moisture, you're going to have pests. And I know I battle with this even in my own office space, because sometimes I'll go in there and there's a bunch of dishes stacked up, and I need to try and convince people, look, we're running the risk of having some pests even in our own offices. So this is some relatively simple, relatively straightforward information that can be communicated to parents. All states have agriculture extension agents that work in urban as well as suburban and rural areas, and these agricultural extension agents are often the best resource that families can get at for this information. And now I'll turn it back to the moderators for questions from me.
Thank you, Jerry. Excellent presentation. I've unmuted Dr. Felice as well, so let me just move right into the questions. First question has to do with diatomaceous earth and what we know about its potential effects, if anything. Diatomaceous earth is for bed bug control, for example. Is it considered a pesticide?
Yes, diatomaceous earth is considered a pesticide. It has relatively low toxicity depending upon where and how it is used. In this instance, the toxicity is going to be primarily from inhalation of the diatomaceous earth dust. So, for example, installation of diatomaceous earth behind walls and behind cove molding and then covering up the hole that was made to instill that diatomaceous earth behind the walls is a reasonable use because there's not going to be any ongoing human exposure. However, when people do broadcast spreading of diatomaceous earth in rooms, I think that has the potential to create its own problems in terms of then exposing the residents of the room to that aerosolized diatomaceous earth, which is very small and can be inhaled and cause a potential, at least, of pulmonary problems.
Thank you. I had a question for you, Jerry. It seems like I think at one point early on you'd talked about the IQ decrements from organophosphate exposure being relatively small. On the other hand, the Eskenazi study showed that they could be as great as 7 points among the offspring of women who had the highest exposures prenatally. But in any case, it's more of a comment than a question. These IQ decrements presumably are happening in kids who are exposed to other kinds of things that might also cause IQ decrements, like mercury or lead, for example. Isn't that right?
That's very true. And, you know, I spend certainly a lot of my time dealing still with lead exposure, lead poisoning to kids in the United States. And so, again, I really want to emphasize that while these IQ decrements may be characterized as, quote, small, unquote, they are still extremely important and absolutely a reason to get a move on in terms of limiting children and pregnant women's and even adults' exposure to pesticides. I don't want to have my use of the adjective small to be interpreted as unimportant, because that's not at all the implication that I'm trying to get across. I think we all should work very hard to get our school districts to stop spraying pesticides in schools, to get our parents to stop routinely having the pest person come in once a month just because somebody thinks that's a good idea. That's a very bad idea.
You should see on your screen here that the AAP not only had the article in Pediatrics by Dr. Roberts and Carr, but also a policy statement. Jerry, did you want to comment at all on the recommendations in the policy statement? There were some to practitioners, but then there were also policy statement recommendations to government.
Right. I think to some extent I've alluded to them without, necessarily calling them out specifically, but pesticide regulations need to be made with this new information that's coming out, this new information needs to be used. It's a different way of understanding the impact of pesticides. We're not only worried about pesticide exposure that makes a kid or an adult keel over and die, we now need to be worried about long-term low-dose exposures to pesticides and the impact on neurocognitive development. And this information needs to be better utilized in the process for regulating pesticides. And again, at the local level, school boards, park boards, city councils, county councils should all be working to limit or eliminate children's exposure to pesticides because of these adverse neurocognitive impacts.
Great, thank you. I think we've got time for 2 more quick questions, and then I'm going to wrap up and try to make it by 1:30 Eastern. Maria Conwell asks, what about recommendations for new mothers or parents who want to bottle feed babies? Some are using bottled spring water, other purified water versus tap water. And any recommendations, I guess, vis-a-vis pesticides or other concerns?
In general, as it relates to tap water in the United States, tap water is the best regulated water out there, and it is safe to drink. Now, for people who are on their own personal wells or wells that serve very small groups of people, these are not regulated by the US EPA or by state or county governments. And so the individuals need to be responsible for checking their own wells, and particularly if they're in an agricultural area or in a suburban area that used to be an agricultural area, they need to check their well water not only for microbial contamination, for nitrates, but they should also be checking their well water for pesticide residues. Clearly, if there is a known problem, Dr. Foreman alluded, for example, to some groundwater contamination with atrazine. If there's a known problem in that area, then the use of bottled water may be appropriate in that specific location.
Great. And any last comments, Dr. Felice, from you or questions? All right, well then, let me thank, before I forget, Susan Youngins from the Pennsylvania chapter of the AAP, who was instrumental in putting this webinar activity together. And I also want to thank Dr. Paulson and Dr. Foreman for 2 excellent presentations. One attendee had asked about the CME evaluation. The form for those evaluations, which again you must fill out in order to get CNE or CME credit, is that URL at the top of the page, which you should see, www.paaap.org, and then you'll see the link to the webinar event and the slides, copies of the slides, as well as copies of the reports we've been talking about and the evaluation are all at that site. So please fill out those evaluations, and again, within 2 weeks. And let me also say, on behalf of my organization, IATP, thank you for attending. And we periodically have other webinars on food-related topics for a health professional audience. And so please consider signing up for those at healthyfoodaction.org. So again, we're approaching the half hour, and I want to thank you very much for your attention and hope you enjoyed the webinar today. Thank you.